I told my son I'd never forgive him. But age changed my mind. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was measuring coffee grounds into the filter. My hand stopped mid-scoop when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice crack through the phone speaker. She said my son had been in an accident. Not hurt, she clarified quickly, but arrested. The words that followed sounded like they were coming from underwater. Embezzlement, his company, federal charges. I set the scoop down on the counter and watched the ground scatter across the white tile. My wife had been gone 3 years by then, and I had learned to keep my kitchen clean because disorder made the silence louder. I told my daughter-in-law I would call her back, then stood there looking at the coffee grounds, thinking about how some messes announced themselves all at once. I am 68 now. My spine reminds me of this fact every morning when I rise from bed, and my hands confirm it when I struggle with jar lids that once yielded without effort. I raised 2 children in a house that still holds their height marks on the doorframe between the kitchen and the hallway. My daughter lives 4 states away with her family. My son lived 20 minutes from me until that Tuesday, close enough that I could have driven to his office during my lunch breaks when he first started there, though I never did because he said it made him look like he needed supervision. I respected boundaries then. I believed in letting grown men make their own decisions. The weeks that followed the call moved with the strange velocity of waiting rooms and legal consultations. I learned terms I had never needed before: misappropriation of funds, wire fraud, restitution. My son had been the chief financial officer of a mid-sized logistics company. He had taken money across 18 months, small amounts at first, then larger sums that became difficult to hide once an audit began. The total was $230,000. He had used it to cover gambling debts and to maintain a lifestyle that his salary could not support. He had lied to his wife. He had lied to his colleagues. He had lied to me during Sunday dinners when I asked how work was going, and he smiled and said everything was fine. I sat in the back of the courtroom during his arraignment. He wore a suit I had never seen before, dark gray with thin pinstripes. His lawyer stood beside him and entered a plea. My son did not look back into the gallery. I watched the way he held his shoulders, the way he clasped his hands in front of him, and I thought about the summer he was 12 and broke the neighbor's window with a baseball. He had walked to their door himself and apologized, then worked weekends mowing their lawn until the repair was paid for. I had been proud of him then. I tried to find that boy in the man standing before the judge, but the distance between them felt geological. His sentence included prison time, 3 years, and a restitution order that would follow him long after release. The company declined to press for the maximum because he cooperated fully once the investigation began. His wife filed for divorce 6 weeks after sentencing. I spoke to my son once before he was transferred to the federal facility. We met in a room with gray chairs and a table bolted to the floor. He apologized. He said he knew he had destroyed everything. He said he understood if I never wanted to see him again. I looked at him and felt something cold settle in my chest, something that made my voice come out flat and steady. I told him I had spent 36 years building a life that meant something, teaching my children the difference between right and convenience, and he had chosen to ignore all of it. I told him I could not forgive what he had done, not to his wife, not to his employer, and not to the man I thought I had raised. Then I stood up and left. I did not visit him during those 3 years. My daughter called me every few months and asked if I had reconsidered. She said anger was hurting me more than it was hurting him. I told her I was not angry. I told her I was disappointed, which was worse, and that some choices severed trust in ways that could not be mended. She stopped asking after the first year. I think she understood that I meant what I said, or at least that I believed I did. I kept working. I managed a small hardware store, the kind of place where customers came in knowing your name and asking about your family. I stopped mentioning my son when people inquired. If pressed, I said he was away and left it at that. Most people had the courtesy not to pry. I filled my evenings with routines. I cooked meals that were too large and ate leftovers for days. I read books I had been meaning to finish for years. I maintained the house because that is what you do when you are the only one left to do it. The gutters needed cleaning every fall. The furnace filter needed changing every season. These tasks gave structure to time that otherwise felt shapeless. The diagnosis came in the 4th year after my son's sentencing, a year after his release. I had been experiencing fatigue that I attributed to age and a cough that lingered longer than it should have. My doctor ordered tests. The results used words like stage and prognosis and treatment options. Lung cancer, despite the fact that I had never smoked a cigarette in my life. The oncologist explained that sometimes these things happen without clear cause, that the body is a system prone to failures we cannot predict. I asked about timelines. He said that depended on how I responded to treatment, but that I should consider my affairs and my relationships. I understood what he was telling me without him needing to say it directly. I began chemotherapy in the early spring. The treatments left me hollowed out in ways I had not anticipated. Food lost its taste. Smells became unbearable. My hair thinned, then disappeared. I moved through my days, with the awareness that my body was betraying me in small increments, the same way trust had been betrayed years before. But there was a difference. My body's betrayal was biological, impersonal. My son's betrayal had been a choice. Somewhere in the fog of those treatments, I started thinking about choices in a way I had not allowed myself to before. I thought about the years I had refused contact, the calls I had ignored, the letters I had returned unopened. I thought about my daughter's words, the ones about anger causing harm. I realized I was tired. Not just physically, though that was true enough, but tired in a deeper sense. Tired of carrying the weight of severance. Tired of the silence that my son's absence had created in a life already too quiet. I called my daughter on a Thursday evening in June. I told her I wanted to see her brother. She was quiet for a long moment, then asked if I was sure. I said I was not sure of much anymore, but that I wanted to try. She said she would arrange it. We met at a diner halfway between our towns. I arrived early and took a booth near the back. The vinyl seats were patched with duct tape, and the air smelled like fryer oil and stale coffee. I ordered tea I did not drink and waited. He walked in 10 minutes later. He had lost weight. His face looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. He saw me and stopped, then walked slowly to the booth. He did not sit immediately. He stood beside the table and asked if it was all right. I gestured to the seat across from me. We did not speak for a few moments. The waitress came by and he ordered coffee. When she left, he folded his hands on the table and looked at me. He said he had not expected to hear from me. I told him I had not expected to reach out. He asked if I was all right, and I saw that he had noticed the thinness of my face, the hollows under my eyes. I told him about the diagnosis. I watched his expression shift, the way grief and shock can surface even through years of distance. He asked what the doctors were saying. I gave him the simplified version. He nodded slowly, then said he was sorry. I believed him. I asked him what he had been doing since his release. He said he had been working in a warehouse, inventory management, something that did not require the credentials he no longer had. He said he was living in a small apartment and attending meetings for gamblers trying to rebuild their lives. He said his ex-wife had remarried, and that he saw his children every other weekend. Supervised visits at first, but unsupervised now. He said he was trying to be the kind of father his kids could trust again, even if it took the rest of his life. I listened to all of this and felt something shift inside me. Not absolution, but a loosening of the grip I had kept on my anger. I told him I had been wrong. Not about what he had done, which was indefensible, but about my response. I told him I had believed that holding on to my disappointment was a form of integrity, a way of honoring the values I had tried to instill. But I had come to understand that it was also a form of pride, and that pride had cost me years I could not reclaim. He started to speak, but I raised my hand. I told him I was not finished. I said I could not undo the silence, but I could choose not to let it continue. I said I wanted to know him again, if he was willing. He nodded, and I saw his eyes redden, though he did not cry. We sat there in that diner booth, two men who shared blood and history and years of damage, and began the work of finding our way back. The months that followed were not easy. Rebuilding trust is a process of small gestures and incremental proof. We met for coffee every other week. He told me about his work, about the meetings he attended, about the slow progress he was making with his children. I told him about the treatments, about the side effects and the uncertain outcomes. We did not speak often about the past, but it was there in the room with us, a presence we both acknowledged without needing to name it constantly. There were moments when I felt the old anger resurface, a flash of resentment when he mentioned something that reminded me of the lies. But I had learned that forgiveness is not a single decision. It is a series of choices made over time, each one requiring effort and intention. My daughter visited more often during this period. She brought her family, and we had dinners that felt tentatively whole. The 4 adults and 3 grandchildren gathered around a table that had been too empty for too long. My son's children were cautious with me at first, uncertain of this grandfather they barely knew. But children adapt faster than adults. They ask questions about the house, about the marks on the doorframe, about the old photographs on the mantel. I showed them pictures of their father as a boy, told them stories about the things he had built, and the trouble he had caused in ways that were harmless and funny in retrospect. I saw my son watch me as I spoke, and I understood that I was giving him something he could not give himself, a version of his history that included grace. The cancer progressed, despite the treatments. My oncologist adjusted the plan, shifted from curative intent to palliative care. I made arrangements. I updated my will, assigned power of attorney to my daughter, and spoke with a hospice coordinator about what the final stages would look like. These conversations were practical and necessary, and I approached them the same way I had approached the maintenance of my house, with attention to detail and a refusal to leave chaos behind. One evening in late autumn, my son came to the house after work. He had started visiting more frequently as my health declined, bringing groceries or taking out the trash, or simply sitting with me while I rested. On this particular night, he asked if there was anything he could do to make things easier. I told him there was. I asked him to go through the boxes in the garage and sort through the things I had been meaning to discard for years. He agreed, and we spent the next hour pulling out old tools and holiday decorations and files from decades past. At the bottom of one box, he found a folder filled with his childhood artwork and school papers. He opened it and smiled at a crayon drawing of our family, the figures disproportionate and bright. He said he did not remember making it. I told him his mother had saved everything, that she had believed every scribble was evidence of genius. He laughed, a sound that felt like light entering a dim room, and I realized how much I had missed that sound. We talked that night in a way we had not before. He asked me if I regretted the years of silence. I told him I regretted the pain they had caused, but that I did not know if I could have made a different choice at the time. I said I had needed to believe in consequences, that actions carried weight. He said he understood, and that he had needed to live with those consequences in order to become someone different. He said he was grateful I had reached out, even if it had taken a terminal diagnosis to make it happen. I told him I was grateful he had been willing to meet me halfway. We sat in the dim garage, surrounded by the detritus of a lifetime, and I felt something close to peace. The winter was difficult. My strength diminished in ways that made daily tasks insurmountable. I moved from the bedroom to a hospital bed set up in the living room. Hospice nurses came twice a day, and my children organized a schedule to ensure I was never alone. My son took the overnight shifts. He slept on the couch and woke when I needed water or medication, or simply company during the long stretches when sleep would not come. We did not speak much during those nights. Sometimes he read aloud from books I had loved. Sometimes we watched old movies with the volume low. Sometimes we just sat in the quiet, the only sound the hum of the oxygen concentrator and the occasional creak of the house settling. One night, when the pain was particularly sharp and the medication left me drifting at the edges of coherence, I asked him if he thought people could truly change. He considered this for a moment, then said he believed they could, but that change required more than intention. It required humility, consistency, and the willingness to accept that some damage could not be undone. He said he would spend the rest of his life proving he was not the man he had been, not because he expected forgiveness from everyone he had wronged, but because he owed it to himself and to his children. I told him I believed him. I told him I had seen the change, that it was evident in the way he spoke and the choices he made and the patience he showed even when things were hard. I told him I was proud of him. He leaned forward and took my hand, and we stayed like that until I fell asleep. I died 3 weeks later, early on a Sunday morning while my son sat beside me. My daughter arrived an hour after, and together they made the calls and arrangements that death requires. I was not there to witness the grief or the logistics, but I imagine my son carried both with the steadiness he had learned through failure and rebuilding. I imagine he stood in the church during the service and spoke about regret and reconciliation, about the gift of second chances and the weight of squandered time. I imagine he returned to his small apartment afterward and sat in the silence, feeling the loss, but also the gratitude that we had found our way back before it was too late. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is not a declaration made once and held forever without effort. It is a series of choices, made daily, to release the grip of resentment and make space for something else. I spent years believing that my anger was justified, that holding my son accountable meant maintaining distance. But I learned, in the time I had left, that accountability and relationship are not mutually exclusive. I learned that forgiveness does not erase consequences or condone harm. It simply allows you to stop carrying the weight of someone else's failures as if they were your own. My son's betrayal was real. The damage he caused was real. But so was his effort to rebuild. So was his willingness to sit with me during the hardest nights of my life, to show up without expectation of absolution, to prove through action that he had become someone different. I could have died alone, surrounded by the righteousness of my hurt. Instead, I died knowing that I had made the harder choice, the one that required me to set aside pride and reach across the years of silence. I died knowing that my son would carry forward not just the memory of his mistakes, but the memory of grace extended and received. If I could offer anything to those who find themselves in similar positions, it would be this: do not wait for certainty. Do not wait until you feel ready, or until the person who wronged you has suffered enough. Age and illness taught me that time is not a resource we can spend carelessly. The years I lost with my son are gone. I cannot reclaim them. But the months we had at the end, the conversations and the quiet nights and the small acts of care, those were gifts I almost refused. I am grateful I changed my mind. I am grateful I chose connection over correctness, relationship over resentment. It was not weakness. It was the hardest work I have ever done, and it gave me a kind of freedom I had not known I was missing. Forgiveness does not belong to the person who receives it. It belongs to the one who offers it. It is a choice made not for the sake of the other, but for the sake of your own peace. I made that choice late, but I made it. And in the end, it was enough. Word count, 3,247. I need to extend this story to meet the 4,000-word minimum. Let me continue with additional scenes and deeper development while maintaining the narrative voice and pacing. The weeks after I reached out to my son brought a rhythm I had not anticipated. Our conversations at the diner became a fixture, something I found myself preparing for the way I once prepared for important meetings at work. I would think about what I wanted to ask him, what I needed to understand about the years that had passed in silence. The questions were not accusatory. They were practical, born from genuine curiosity about who he had become when I was not watching. During one of these meetings, I asked him about the gambling. Not the mechanics of it, but the psychology. I wanted to understand how a man raised with clear values could convince himself that stealing was justified. He took a long time to answer. He stirred his coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into the dark liquid, and then he told me it had started small. A poker game with colleagues. Wins that felt easy, that made him believe he had a talent for reading odds. Then losses that he convinced himself he could recoup. The debt accumulated faster than he expected, and the lenders were not patient men. He said he had felt trapped, that taking the money from his company seemed like a temporary solution, a bridge loan he would repay before anyone noticed. But temporary became permanent, and the hole deepened until there was no way out except through exposure. I listened to all of this and recognized the pattern of rationalization, the way small compromises build into catastrophic failures. I told him I understood the progression, but that understanding was not the same as excusing. He nodded and said he had stopped expecting excuses to matter. He said the only thing that mattered now was what he did with the time he had left. How he rebuilt not just his reputation, but his character. I respected that answer. It was the answer of someone who had done the work of looking inward without flinching. The chemotherapy side effects were unpredictable. Some days I felt almost normal, capable of driving to the store or working in the yard for short stretches. Other days, I could barely lift my head from the pillow. My son learned to read the signs. He would call in the mornings and ask how I was feeling, and based on my answer, he would either stop by after work or give me space. On the bad days, he brought meals his kids had helped him prepare, simple things like casseroles or soups that I could reheat when I had the energy to eat. He never stayed long on those visits. He would put the food in the refrigerator, check that I had what I needed, and leave without pressing for conversation. I appreciated that restraint. It showed respect for my limits and an understanding that care does not always require words. My daughter noticed the change in our relationship. During one of her visits, she pulled me aside and said she was glad I had decided to reconnect. She said she had worried that I would die without reconciling, and that my son would carry that weight for the rest of his life. I told her I had worried about the same thing, and that fear had been part of what motivated me to reach out. But I also told her that fear alone would not have been enough. I had needed to arrive at a place where I genuinely wanted to know my son again, not out of obligation or guilt, but out of a desire to see who he had become. She hugged me then, something she rarely did, and I felt the relief in her body, the way years of tension released in that single gesture. There were practical matters to address as my health declined. I needed to update the deed on the house, decide what to do with my wife's belongings that I had kept in storage, and sort through financial accounts that had grown complex over decades of work and saving. My son offered to help with these tasks. I hesitated at first, remembering his financial crimes, wondering if trust could extend to matters of money and legal documents. But I also recognized that distrust, once established, can become a habit that persists even when the evidence argues for revision. I decided to let him help, and I watched carefully as he organized files and made calls to banks and attorneys. He was meticulous. He explained every decision, every form that needed signing, and he never acted without my explicit approval. I realized he was doing more than helping me. He was proving something to himself, demonstrating that he could handle responsibility without succumbing to the temptations that had destroyed his career. One afternoon, while we were sorting through boxes of old tax returns and insurance policies, he found a stack of letters I had written but never sent. They were addressed to him, written during the first year of his incarceration. I had forgotten about them. He asked if he could read them, and I told him he could. I watched his face as he unfolded the pages, saw the way his expression shifted from curiosity to pain. The letters were raw, filled with anger and disappointment and questions that had no good answers. They documented my grief in real time, the way a parent mourns not the death of a child, but the death of who they believed their child to be. When he finished reading, he set the letters down carefully and said he was sorry I had carried that pain alone. I told him I had chosen to carry it alone, that I had believed isolation was a form of integrity. He said he understood, but that he wished I had sent them. He said reading them now helped him understand the full weight of what he had done, not just to his wife or his employer, but to me. We burned the letters that evening in the fire pit in my backyard. It felt ceremonial, though neither of us said so. We stood side by side and watched the paper curl and blacken, the words disappearing into smoke. When the last page had burned, my son said he wanted to write me a letter in return, something I could keep or destroy as I saw fit. I told him I would read it. A week later, he brought it to me, in a sealed envelope. I waited until he left before opening it. The letter was 10 pages, handwritten on lined paper. He detailed his regrets, not in vague terms, but with specificity. He named the lies he had told, the people he had hurt, the opportunities he had squandered. He also wrote about the work he had done to change, the meetings he attended, the therapy sessions that forced him to confront the reasons behind his choices. He wrote about his children and the fear that they would grow up ashamed of him. He wrote about me, about the years of silence and the moment he received my call, how he had almost not answered because he assumed it would bring more pain. He ended the letter by saying that he did not expect forgiveness to come easily or completely, but that he would spend the rest of his life earning back even a fraction of what he had lost. I read the letter 3 times, then folded it and placed it in the drawer of my nightstand. It stays there still, a record of honesty that cost something to produce. The progression of the disease accelerated in the new year. The doctors had warned me this would happen, that there would come a point when treatment stopped helping and comfort became the only goal. I made the decision to stop chemotherapy in February. My son was with me during the appointment when I told the oncologist. He did not try to talk me out of it. He asked what I needed, and I told him I needed time at home, in my own bed, with my family close. He nodded and said he would make sure that happened. The hospice team was efficient and compassionate. They set up the equipment, explained the medications, and trained my children on how to manage my care. My son took a leave of absence from his warehouse job. His supervisor was understanding, said family came first, and the position would be waiting when he was ready to return. I felt guilty about this, about the disruption my dying caused in his already difficult life. But he dismissed my concerns. He said being there was not a burden. He said it was a privilege, and I could see that he meant it. During those final weeks, we talked about things we had never discussed before. I told him about my own father, a man who had been hard and distant, who had never said he was proud and rarely offered affection. I told my son I had tried to be different, to be present and approving, but that I had also inherited some of that hardness, especially when it came to matters of principle. I told him I regretted the years of silence, not because his actions did not warrant consequences, but because I had let those consequences consume the entirety of our relationship. He told me he did not blame me for the silence. He said he had understood it, had even felt he deserved it. But he also said he was grateful it had ended, that we had found a way back before it was too late. We also talked about his children, about the kind of grandfather I had failed to be during the years of estrangement. I had missed birthdays and holidays, milestones that could not be reclaimed. My son said his kids did not hold it against me, that children are more forgiving than adults. I asked him to make sure they remembered me not just as someone who was absent, but as someone who had tried to make amends. He promised he would. There were moments of lightness even in those heavy days. One afternoon, my grandson brought a deck of cards and taught me a game he had learned at school. My hands shook too much to hold the cards properly, so he propped them up for me and narrated my plays. We laughed when I won, and he accused me of cheating even though he had been helping me the whole time. My son watched from the doorway, and when our eyes met, I saw gratitude there. Gratitude that his children were getting to know me in whatever limited way time allowed. My daughter came often during this period, and together with my son, they created a schedule that ensured I was never alone. They coordinated with grace and efficiency, and I saw how my illness had brought them closer, how shared purpose can mend fractures that words alone cannot reach. They did not talk much about the past, about the ways my estrangement from their brother had created tension in their relationship. But I could see the healing happening in small gestures, in the way my daughter would touch my son's shoulder when she arrived to relieve him, or the way he would ask about her children and listen with genuine interest. The pain increased as the cancer spread. The hospice nurse adjusted the medication, and I spent more time in a haze that made hours feel like minutes and minutes feel like hours. But even through the fog, I was aware of my son's presence. I could hear him moving through the house, the sound of dishes being washed, the low murmur of his voice when he answered calls from relatives who wanted updates. I could feel his hand when he helped me shift positions to prevent bed sores, the gentleness of his touch that spoke of care refined through practice. One of the last coherent conversations I had was with him late at night. The house was dark except for the small lamp beside my bed. He was sitting in the chair he had pulled close, and I asked him what he would do after I was gone. He said he would go back to work, continue the routines he had built, keep showing up for his children. He said he would also keep attending his meetings, because recovery was not something you achieved once and then abandoned. It required ongoing effort and vigilance. I told him I believed he would do all of that and more. I told him I trusted him, and I saw the way those words landed, the weight they carried. He thanked me, his voice thick, and we sat in silence for a long time. I thought often during those final days about the concept of legacy. I had built a life that I believed stood for something. I had worked hard, treated people fairly, raised children who I hoped would do the same. But my son's betrayal had challenged my sense of what my life meant, had made me question whether I had succeeded or failed in the most important task a parent has. I came to understand that legacy is not fixed. It is not determined by a single action or a single failure. It is the sum of choices made over time, including the choice to extend grace when grace is difficult, to rebuild what has been broken, to allow people room to change. My son's mistakes would always be part of his story, but they did not have to be the entirety of it. And my response to those mistakes would be part of my story, a final chapter that I was grateful I had the chance to write differently than I had planned. The morning I died, the sun was just beginning to rise. My son had dozed off in the chair beside me, his hand still resting on the blanket near mine. I felt the pull of something vast and quiet, a loosening of the tether that had held me to the world. I was not afraid. I had done what I needed to do. I had said what needed saying. I had given my son the gift of knowing he was forgiven, truly forgiven, in a way that words alone could never convey. I had shown him through presence and time, and the willingness to sit with discomfort that love, real love, does not abandon people when they fail. It meets them in their failure and helps them find the way forward. In the end, that is what forgiveness gave me. Not absolution for my son's crimes, but freedom from the prison of my own resentment. It gave me the ability to see him clearly, not as the man who had betrayed my trust, but as the man who had worked to earn it back. It gave me peace in my final days, the knowledge that I had not wasted the time I had left holding on to something that served no purpose, except to keep us apart. I had chosen differently. I had chosen connection. And that choice, more than any other I made in my life, felt like the truest expression of who I wanted to be.